Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another monthly free webinar from Smith School of Business. My name is Meredith Dalt. I'm a business journalist here at Smith, and I'm very pleased to be your host and moderator today. We have a good webinar today, the new workplace, how to build effective hybrid teams, something I know is top of mind for a lot of people right now. And as always, today's webinar is presented by Smith Business Insight and by Queen's Executive Education. I want to remind you, as I always do, today's webinar will be recorded. You will automatically be getting a link to the recording in your inbox. You'll get that in a couple of days, so keep your eyes on your inbox for that. Also, the presentation format today will be a formal presentation from our guest and then an open floor Q&A. So I do encourage you to ask questions as they come up. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can at the end, but if your questions are near the top, we can get to them sooner. So ask your questions often. Use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you would. Thank you. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest, Dr. Jana Raver. Jana Raver is the E. Marie Shantz Professor of Organizational Behavior at Smith School of Business at Queen's University. She's also cross-appointed to the university's Department of Psychology. Dr. Raver is an authority on interpersonal relations and team dynamics at work, with a specific emphasis on the ways in which employees build and sustain high-performance teams. She is also an expert on workplace diversity and cultural differences. Her award-winning research has been published in numerous prestigious journals, and it is our pleasure to invite Dr. Jana Raver to take the floor. Jana, I'm going to step away, mute myself, turn off my screen, and you are now officially in charge. I'll be back to field questions at the end.
All right, thank you so much, Meredith, and thank you to all of you for joining us here on this afternoon. I know this is a topic of interest to many of you, and I've been getting lots and lots of questions about this in the last several months as organizations move to hybrid. So let me get my slides going on here, and we'll get going. So back at the very beginning of the pandemic, I think it was actually in the spring of 2020, I ran a session for Smith Insight on building virtual teams, being able to lead virtual teams really effectively. Now, we've had a long journey since then. We've got more than 2 years of pandemic and a lot of learnings and lessons from the early days of struggling with how to be virtual to where we are today with how do we go back to the workplace. Who would have thought a couple of years ago that we'd all be struggling with how to be face-to-face? This is such a different world that we live in. So the session here today is going to synthesize a lot of the work that I've done over the years, some of the research knowledge. I have been here at Smith. I've been teaching on virtual teams, and actually global multinationals have been using hybrid teams for decades. And so we do have a lot of knowledge in terms of some of the courses I've been teaching that I bring into bear the research on this topic, as well as the practice and the incredible acceleration of knowledge that we've had in the last couple of years, just with regard to how to be effective in these areas. And I've worked with a lot of clients and a lot of organizations and given many sessions on this in the last couple of years. So I'll share some of that knowledge as we go. As Meredith said, though, I would very much like your participation in terms of asking questions, and we'll have time for that at the end. And we're also going to have an audience engagement opportunity here in a few minutes. So I'd like to hear some more from you there. Where we're headed, we're going to start with that overview of work trends. So how did we get here, and what is the current status of hybrid teams? What are organizations doing, and how are you feeling about hybrid teams as well? The core of our session, I'm going to walk through what I think of as a recipe. It's a model, a framework that you can use, that if you get all 4 elements of this correct, then you can be way more effective at consistently over time being able to actually lead or work in hybrid teams in a way that's very effective. So that consists of both designing them, the actual collaboration or structural design, both so that you have a face-to-face architecture and a collaboration architectural virtually. What does that virtual architecture look like, and how do you decide how to communicate within it is the second part. Trust and positivity is absolutely key. If you don't have that benefit of the doubt and the positive relationships in place, then you're going to struggle with the rest of this. And the same thing with regard to shared culture. We need to focus way more about how to actually maintain our team cultures. And as I said, we have some Q&A at the end with envisioning kind of where to go from here and solving some of the challenges. So, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, we were talking about how everybody was going to be shifting suddenly to this virtual space. And there was panic. Absolutely, everyone was saying, I don't know how we're going to do this. We did it. We successfully managed it. But it was a lot of difficulty. Everything from, how do I, where you're on mute, and, how do I work with this, this Zoom platform? How do I actually work with Microsoft Teams? How do I, all these kind of virtual challenges, we made it work. And yet now, after we've just gotten into this stable space of most people working at a distance for a very long time now, we get to our stable routines of doing that, and we've got to have everything disrupted. Now, as I mentioned, I started getting questions about hybrid teams about a year ago, where people said, okay, we're coming out of the pandemic, we're going to be going back to the office. How do we do this effectively? The good news is that the opportunity to be away from the workplace gave organizations the time and the space to actually think more put more thought and think more intentionally about what this might look like in the future, because the data along the way made it really, really clear that the vast majority of employees, depending upon the survey, 2/3 or even 3/4 of employees are saying they don't want to. Even a year into the pandemic, they're saying they do not want to go back to the work full time, to be able to work the 8:30 to 4:30 or the 8 to 5 or whatever your hours are. This is not a desire, because people got used to the virtual and they enjoyed some of the benefits. And we'll get to that in just a second. Now, it was challenging, but most organizations and individuals actually found that it worked. This crazy thought that before the pandemic, people thought, oh, there's no way we could actually run our organizations on Zoom or on Slack or on Microsoft Teams. And yet the shift to remote work was largely successful. So this was just almost a year in, even that early, people are saying, well, if you ask employees, about 71%, and this PricewaterhouseCoopers survey, were saying, yeah, it was actually pretty successful, that we feel like we're actually able to do our work. We know how to contribute to the organization. And from employers' perspective, 83% were saying, yeah, it was largely successful. And that was actually borne out in many of the productivity statistics as well. So rather than finding that organizations were struggling, many organizations were finding that they were even more productive. So if in those organizations with optimized models, meaning that they actually did a really good job of leading their teams, their virtual teams effectively, this is a BCG set of analyses here, found that there was increases in productivities. So depending upon the organization, so 15 to 40% increases in productivity. And you think about that, some of us were doing that because, well, what else are you going to do? We're in the middle of a pandemic, so we were working these really long hours. Everyone was just saying, well, I might as well keep working, or there's no boundary between my work and my home. Or perhaps for some of you, I don't have to spend an hour and a half commuting into the office anymore and an hour and a half home, so I've got more time on my hands. So it made sense that people were actually putting some more time and energy into their work where they could. Now, that was not, of course, across the board for everyone, because we had the challenges of school closures as well, and many other distractions and difficult suboptimal work environments when we're working from home. But people were able to adapt to many of those things over the couple of years that we were really forced to work remotely. As you can imagine, absenteeisms were down. Reduction in turnover was very much in place. We're starting to see that change as the Great Resignation is starting, where people are saying, look, enough already. And we've actually had many people at the cusp of retirement saying they're going to leave now. And so now we've got a different problem going on of the challenge for getting and actually retaining talent, now that we've actually got to compete with people everywhere. But ultimately, and organizations were also loving this, because real estate and resource usages costs were down. So rather than saying, let's all rush back to the office, both employees and employers were saying, well, maybe there's some benefits here that we need to actually maintain, but we've got to overcome some of these other issues. Because the shift to remote work was successful, but productivity came at a cost. And there's several of these costs. What I'm showing on this slide is actually a workforce analytics data from Microsoft. And so what they are showing is pre-pandemic, February 2020, versus middle of the pandemic, or amidst of the pandemic, February 2021, just comparing the amount of productivity, the amount of digital data, what the digital footprint was looking like. And if you think that you were spending a lot more time in meetings, if your day was just back to back to back meetings, well, yeah, you weren't alone. and 148% increase in meetings from pre-pandemic to a year into the pandemic. Increase, this is across Microsoft's databases, but 40.6 billion more emails, 45% increase in chat, 66% of increase in documents. People were working more, people were working harder, and frankly, we're all a little bit burnt out. And this is where we see this productivity came at a cost, and many employees were struggling. Many employees are still struggling for different reasons right now. It's not because of the virtual remote entirely, but also because of the challenges of the hybrid on the horizon. Many people during the pandemic were very fond of saying, you know, we're in this together. But honestly, if we might be all in the same storm, but we were never in the same boat. The challenges of working remotely hit people differently depending upon, for example, younger single employees, new employees. Most of them were reporting, so the 64%, 67% reporting that they were struggling, just kind of barely surviving. This is tough. If the workplace is part of your social network, that you need that social engagement, you need a part of the culture, you don't really know how the organization works, it's hard if you're completely isolated working from your maybe efficiency apartment downtown metropolitan area. You're working from your bedroom. It's not exactly the nicest. Frontline employees, Gen Z, definitely struggling. Working parents, so working moms in particular, people who are married, a little bit more on the lines of struggling. Business leaders, maybe not as much. And so business leaders say they were struggling to 39%, but most were actually thriving. They didn't necessarily see all of the challenges that on the backs of the employees who were kind of bearing the increased productivity challenges. So we've come a long way, but we're also at a point of reckoning. And that point of reckoning is where people have to say, all right, so as we come out of the pandemic, where do we go from here? And what I'd like to do with all of us right now is I'd like to get some of what your thoughts and reactions are to where we've been as well as where we're going. And the way I'd like to do that is with a Poll Everywhere poll. Now, some of you may have used Poll Everywhere before, and if we could drop the link into the chat, that would be helpful. What I'm looking for, what we're going to do is produce a word cloud. Now, a word cloud works best with one word, so I'll emphasize if you can think of one word, and it could be a thought, a feeling, some sort of a reaction that you have to your feelings or thoughts about working in fully virtual teams, kind of where we've been, what we're coming out of now in terms of people being able to work remotely at will, to be able to connect predominantly in virtual collaboration, Zoom meetings, Microsoft Teams meetings, and so forth. So I'm going to give that, I'll be quiet here about 30 seconds while everyone starts to answer the question, and then I'll show the results as they come up. All right, I'm going to start to share the results, and you can continue to add. This will keep moving in the background as we're talking about it. I've done this for a number of sessions with a bunch of audiences in the last few months, and this reminds me of, and it's similar to what I've seen. We see flexibility, but also disconnection. So these are the two words that have come up again and again and again as I've done this, and different derivatives of them. What I find interesting, there's a productive that comes out often. So productive, efficient, so that things are actually getting done. You're able to actually focus upon your work. People are able to be individually productive. But again, that productivity, that efficiency, it comes at the cost of feeling like you're alone. There's this kind of lonely, isolated. We see strain. We see out of touch. These type of words of being, feeling like, I just sit in my living room. I sit at my kitchen table. I sit at my home office. I sit in my bedroom all day, and yeah, I'm doing this, but I don't really know what I'm part of anymore. That feeling of isolation is what has characterized a lot of our experiences. And I'm going to be talking about that more today. There is the possibility for hybrid starting to address some of these things. But what I've heard from many, many people, and I think I see reflected in flexibility here as well, is People like the ability to not have to rush in through the morning commute. They like the ability to not have to pay for the extra parking. They like the ability to be able to cook at home. They like to be able to listen to the music that they want to. They like the flexibility of being able to go for a walk in the middle of the day. To have all of the kind of the comforts of home and the comforts of flexibility is also something that we don't want to give up. So we need to somehow find a way to rebuild that connection and to make people feel like they're part of something and not so lonely and, you know, out there alone in their homes, while maintaining some of that flexibility. Now, from an organizational scholarship perspective, so in organizational behavior, my field of study, we have been trying to convince leaders in organizations for quite some time, for a couple of decades, that people really can be productive and efficient without being micromanaged. People can be trusted. People can actually do their work effectively, and we don't have to force them into the office all the time in order to do so. It's kind of been called telecommuting, it's been called flex work, it's been called, I know, increasing work-life interface, actually addressing the work-life interface. So we've known this for a long time, that people can do this more effectively. The pandemic just suddenly forced leaders in all organizations to listen and actually make changes. So we don't want to go back to the way things were. We want to maintain that flexibility while addressing some of the, you know, the challenges here, the impersonal, lonely, you know, and perhaps more complicated approaches. All right, I'm going to come back to my slides for just a second, and then we're going to do another one of these. So the question that I'm going to ask next is to think instead now about hybrid teams. Now, this is where we're headed. This is where we're going to be going, and I'm going to get the presentation going here. In 1 second. Okay. So if we go to hybrid teams, I want you to think about a word or feeling that comes to mind there. Now, this can be something that you're currently worried about or your current experience. So if your organization is just on the cusp of doing this and you haven't yet become hybrid, then it could be something that you're concerned about. But if you're currently doing hybrid teams, if it could reflect your thoughts or feelings. And again, I'll be quiet here while this populates, and then I'll show you what's coming up. Okay, I'm going to show the results as we're starting to come in here. Okay, so flexibility, those absolutely front and center. What I find interesting here, we don't see efficient and productive, we don't see as much of the upside. What we see is disconnected, we see challenging, we see confusing, but there's also, you know, some concerning, so energizing, so there's trepidations, there's this worry, there's watching, there's, I saw FOMO start to come up, there's opportunity. So there's, I saw cautiously optimistic there as well. So I see inefficient, I see disjointed. So there's a, it has potential. It could offer that, it could maintain the flexibility. We like that it maintains the flexibility, but I'm really confused. I don't know what to do. It's disjointed. There's opportunity, but I don't know how to overcome some of these challenges. There's concerns. I see inequitable in there. I see forced. I see compromise, demotivating. So a lot of questions and confusion and concern. So like I said, we wanted to maintain that flexibility, and hybrid gives us that. But there's this big looming question of, how do we do this? If some people are virtual, some people are face-to-face, we're trying to solve that problem of building community, of trying to make people feel connected again. And yet the solution to that seems to be more disjointed and more kind of disconnected. So how do we do this? And this is where we need to dive in for today. Thank you for sharing all of your thoughts and your experiences here. I think this resonates with a lot of what I've been hearing recently. And I'm looking forward to having Q&A with you at the end as well. But let me give you some structure and some tools in our session here that might help to overcome some of these big questions and the confusion around hybrid teams. So In particular, if I was going to cluster together, and by the way, this is true of virtual and hybrid teams, if I was going to cluster all of the big problems that I keep hearing again and again and again, and by the way, what research has shown as well in terms of what the key challenges of working in virtual or hybrid, what we call distributed teams. When we have distributed teams, we get three main sets of problems. Number one is isolation. That's what you first told me. We have this isolation of these virtual teams. Strangely enough, though, we also have an isolation in hybrid teams as well. So it gets better, but then there's this fear of missing out. There's this, wait a second, I'm not in the office at the same time. What happens if everybody is in the office and I'm at home? If we don't share the same experience, if we don't have that unity, and you're also scared that you can't see other people as well. So if you're the one person who's virtual, everybody else is there, they're laughing, they're enjoying a lunch together, you might not have the same sense of inclusion. So there's that question of inclusion, exclusion that happens along with isolation. Fragmentation. This is, when we see in the virtual teams, this idea of, people saying there's disconnected. This is really that disconnected, fragmented, feeling like, well, we don't really have this shared purpose anymore. What are we doing? I don't really feel connected, or I don't have any cohesion with the rest of my group. We don't have common ground. There's this, the team has just splintered. This is a huge problem that has been happening during the pandemic when everybody's fully remote. It might be that individual productivity was up, but it has come at the cost of team cohesion and of managing the corporate culture and being able to actually network and then to break down those silos. So we've had everything set fragmented into little silos and to individual workplaces where everyone has their own workplace in their home. So we've got to pull people back together and address that fragmentation that's been happening. The confusion. This is about communication. It's either too much communication, too little communication. It might be that there's conflicting assumptions. It might be that right now the confusion is about hybrid, where you're getting mixed messages from your leaders, or you're getting mixed messages from your boss. Like, how much do we have to be in? And how do we communicate? Are we doing face-to-face? Are we doing virtual? Are we using the Microsoft Teams for everything? Are we back to in-person? How are we going to communicate in order to actually get things done? And without clarity of norms and expectations of how we communicate and which channels of communication that we use, then it leads to this difficulty of even being able to get the message across in the first place, much less get people bonded and overcome these isolation challenges. So this is what we have to tackle moving forward in order to have effective hybrid teams. What I want to think about is different ways of working. And rather than, and there's a video from Gartner I'm going to share with you here that I like. Everyone keeps saying, well, it's going to be, remote or face-to-face, remote or face-to-face. And what I want you to think about instead is different ways of working and why we have to be one versus the other and how we can best make use of one versus the other. So let me play the video and then we'll come back and talk about it a little bit more for the different modes of working and how to make the best of those.
Today, I want to talk to you about the future of hybrid and what that means for how we think about how we work. Most organizations are thinking about the future of work in terms of location. Where will we spend most of our time? Will it be in the office? Will it be at home? Will we be co-located? Will we be distributed? Many organizations are advocating for the return to this traditional way of working together. But employees want something different. 75% of knowledge workers say their expectations for working flexibly have increased. Organizations thinking about the future of work in a progressive way are not just evaluating where we'll be spending our time, but how we will be spending it. Think of it this way. We will have two options when it comes to location: co-located or distributed. And we have two modes when it comes to time spent: synchronous or asynchronous. This gives us 4 modes of working. HR leaders usually rank the synchronous modes as being more important to team innovation. That's because we're still operating in a culture of meetings. But our analysis shows that asynchronous work is just as important as synchronous work. Individuals need deep, focused time to restore their mental energy. Organizations need to invest more in those asynchronous modes that contribute equally to innovation. Yet only 17% of HR leaders have implemented no meetings days, 11% have provided dedicated mental health days, and only 1% have implemented no email days. Organizations that succeed in the future of work will invest equally in all 4 of these modes and enable teams to collaborate across each. They will reconfigure their on-site spaces so that when we are working together, we have the right environments to carry out in-person collaboration. They will understand how to use third spaces like cafes or co-working offices to encourage employee networking for those moments where we are working alone together. They will provide the tools and technology we need to make the virtual experience of working together apart less draining and more intentional. And they will empower employees to make use of their time alone apart, whether it's on a run, meditating, brainstorming, or sitting quietly in their thoughts. Think about it this way. Every band needs time together, alone, and apart to write its best songs, developing the lyrics in their own time, riffing off a great melody together, jumping on the phone to play back the last recording. Let's make sure your teams are set to create their best music. Hybrid working expands the number of modes of working that are crucial to innovation. Let's make sure we improve our access to all of these modes and invest in improving the quality of each mode to truly drive performance in the hybrid environment.
Okay, so what this video gets at is it's not just virtual in person. It's not just one or the other, but we have to think more intentionally about what are we going to do together. So when we are working together, what needs to be the priority? And in team language and team researchers language, this would be about team task interdependence, or how interdependent the work is that we're going to be doing. If we're doing something that requires us to be very interdependent with each other, then it may actually be better for us to be working together. Now, and we could also be working together apart on certain tasks that don't require everyone to be physically co-located. But individual productivity work has also been really important. This is actually one of the big benefits we've seen during the pandemic, where everyone's distributed, as we could all focus on getting our work done for a change. Do you remember in those pre-pandemic days that, there was just meeting after meeting after meeting, and some of you are still living that, believe me, I understand. But if you never actually got the ability to sit down and do your work. And so this working alone element of it, of actually being able to have focused individual productivity time, is another key lesson that we need to have. So when we're working alone, either apart or working alone together, we need to have the time and space for that as well. So hybrid work and having these options is actually forcing us to think about, when do we need to collaborate and when do we need to focus and do individual work, and actually carving out time and space for both of those things. And it's really crucial lesson moving forward to make sure that we don't prioritize only the working together or only the working alone, and keeping that in mind in all of our collaborations. So then what is that? What is this recipe that I keep talking about? I think of it as, we have that rocky foundation, the isolation, fragmentation, and cohesion. We've got to build a solid foundation there that then allows us to get to engagement, cohesion, and clarity. And in doing so, we can build a house. We can build this hybrid design, if you will, this hybrid collaboration house, where we get the right structural design in it first. It has to be mirrored with, on top of that, it has to be mirrored with this collaboration or communication architecture that exists in the virtual space. And then honestly, none of this works. The entire house falls apart if you don't have trust and positivity and a team culture that's intentionally built and attended to. So let's dive into the first element. The bottom floor, if you will, is this hybrid team design. I start here, and by the way, I could start anywhere in the model. Excuse me, I start with the hybrid team design, at least in part because it's the thing that most organizations are struggling with right now. And it's the place where most of you are making decisions that might become very strong norms, and you have to think carefully about which way to go in terms of designing your teams from a hybrid perspective. Now, this picture that you're seeing on this slide, this is kind of a desk with like a homicide chalk around the desk there to say, like, is the office dead? And people have been asking that question as well. Maybe we don't need offices anymore. And there's a lot of questions going on about, well, if we don't want to go back to the full-time office, then why do we need an office? If it's not dead, what's the purpose of it? And what the research on this is showing, not just during the pandemic, but also way more now, in every session that I've done on this, people come back to a couple of key messages as to why we need the office. I'm going to point over to the employees side in particular, but number one, for employees, collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. If we remember that back to that word cloud we just did on the virtual office, people are disconnected, that sense of isolation, disconnection. And it's not just kind of a personal thing. It means that we're not able to feel like we're connected to the culture and the purpose of the organization anymore. We don't have cohesion with our team, and that's that fragmentation. So one of the key purposes of a face-to-face office is to actually enable collaboration at a deeper level for that working together. This is when we need to brainstorm, when we need to really dig into problem solve, when we need to solve conflicts, when we need to do the more complex cognitive, intellectual, and interpersonal tasks that do require a certain amount of connection. Other things here, so according to employees, that's really what they need. Meeting with clients or colleagues, again, those interpersonal rapport, interpersonal connection. We have a difficult time feeling like we actually know somebody and can truly trust them, and I'll get to trust in a little bit, unless we have that face-to-face. There's other reasons as well. So we do actually, depending upon your line of work, there may be records, there may be resources. It may be that you are working in a efficiency apartment and you've been sitting on your bed working and it's just not good. You don't have a decent office chair. It might be that you don't have decent internet. It might be that you've been sharing your Wi-Fi with 4 other people in the household and you're about done with it from bandwidth perspective. So there's resources that you need that are in the office as well. Another thing that comes up from employees, it's listed here as training and career development, but I hear a lot of networking, just being able to actually see people in the organization and get the information and resources, but then also mentor, develop, reconnect on a human level for your own career development purposes. On the employer side of things, this made me kind of shake my head for the employers. Like, number one that came up, and this was about a year into the pandemic, was increasing employee productivity. I shook my head because I'm like, okay, people, leaders, you do not need to micromanage your employees to be productive. I think if the pandemic has taught us nothing, it's that people are mature adults who will actually focus and do their work individually and be productive regardless. The challenge is that they need to be motivated and they need to have that alignment with the organizational culture and with the team in order to maintain that focus and productivity and to maintain that morale that has been faltering in many contexts. We do need the space to meet with clients, encouraging collaboration. So this is the collaboration bit again and again, and enabling the company culture. So what we know is that we need the organization face-to-face time, so that when people bother to get dressed in the morning and they put on their, their nice outfits, nice work outfits, and they put on their makeup or they do their hair or they and they drive the hour to get into the office, that it needs to be something that prioritizes this. The worst that I've seen is when, and I'm hearing this a lot, is that people are taking the time to bother to drive in, or they're being forced back into the office in some instances to sit on Zoom all day. I've been there. It's completely demotivating. It's awful to walk around an organization and the hallways are empty and everyone is just sitting in their offices on Zoom. Well, what's the purpose of an office? It's not to come into your office at work or into your cubicle at work and sit on Zoom. That's not the purpose. So we need to change the way we think about what we do in the office. If we're working together, working together alone, but together, we need spaces that allow for that. So that's where the hybrid team design solution comes in. We need people-centric interaction spaces. And what I mean by that is they need to have purpose-built hybrid design and technologies. When people do come together, and I would, by the way, encourage all of you to have full team meetings if you can on a semi-regular basis. It doesn't have to be every week. It doesn't have to be every other week. But regardless, you need to make sure that your hybrid or your face-to-face environments actually enable collaboration and discussion. So we need to have face-to-face meetings with improved technology. If in your organization you have not yet invested in the kind of improved cameras and the hybrid technology, then it is time. It is beyond time to be able to actually improve your meeting spaces. Because the days of having that laptop sit on the table and be turning it around to talk to people, those days are over. We need to actually have interaction spaces where people can actually hear each other, where they can actually speak to each other. And the technology consistently works so that when you sit down at a meeting, you can be sure that everyone who attends is going to be able to actually participate and be heard fully. We also need to have spaces where people think of those informal chit chats, the things that happen before a meeting, the walking down the hallway to a meeting and catching up with somebody, or walking away from meeting and reflecting upon what you just discussed. They often don't think about that as work, but it is work. And it is actually really important work. It's the work of maintaining the organizational culture, of actually bonding people, of actually building cohesion. So your face-to-face spaces need to have things to lure people back in. Do company lunches, do some social events, have coffees, get people together to even just schmooze. Remember that we have just been taught for the last 2+ years that we should stay away from everybody. So people are understandably reticent to come back and engage. We've all been, kind of almost punished for being able to be around other people and told to keep our distance. So we need to retrain everybody on the benefits of actually having informal interactions, doing it safely, doing it in ways that actually maintains the PPE and employee health, but encouraging some degrees of informal interactions, hallway chats, all of those awkward moments where you don't even remember someone, you can barely even tell who someone is because it's been so long since you've had that hallway chit chat. Do it. Even if it feels awkward, it's good for you. Rebuild those social bonds. That's what part of the office is for. We need that cross-team networking. If you and your team have been working in silos, find ways, and it might be through design of the workplace where you start running into people from other teams on a regular basis. That helps with cross-team networking. And you can also do it purposefully. Build in meetings where people are actually going to reconnect face-to-face with people from other departments, for maybe town halls or whatever it is that you have to get together for. But make sure that all this is done in a way that is going to make people feel safe to come back. A couple other tips on this. One of the things that we know will happen and continuously happens is what's called this distancing bias. Now, social distancing, which is actually a term that's been used by sociologists for a long time, refers to this lack of emotional or cognitive connection. If you think that you're being kind of isolated because you're the one hybrid person and everybody else is having a great time and you haven't gone back into the office, you're staying virtual, and if you feel like you're being distanced or isolated, it's a very real thing. And the evidence on this is also very clear that when people turn into this kind of us versus them mentality, and this is in particular the far away, so people who do not work close, people who are at a different office, a different headquarters, a different department, as soon as that starts to happen, we get very predictable sets of consequences. And those consequences are, low trust and empathy and understanding. We also get in-group favoritism. So if you are kind of what we call an isolate, so you work at one site away from everybody, and you're like, I keep getting passed over, and I raise my hand, but nobody comes to me in meetings. What's going on with that? I'm trying to speak and no one listens. It's probably a very real phenomenon. So if you're leading a team where not everybody is face-to-face or not everybody is virtual, you need to be aware that those who are at a distance are probably being disadvantaged, and it's outside of your awareness. It's a bias that happens very, very naturally outside of most people's awareness. So if you're not actively trying to disrupt this bias, chances are it is affecting your team. So some things that you can do, build and play up the group level identity. Always make sure that every person in your team is aware of, what the shared purpose is, what the goals are, what their role is in the team. More importantly, point number 2 on the slide, I think, is to recognize this bias. It is happening. If you don't have everybody on the same page, if not everybody is included in the exact same way, likely is that it is happening. So rather than just ignoring it, take some specific steps to actually change the status differentials, to try to eliminate or change those status differentials. So something that you might want to think, but I would actually say is really essential nowadays, make sure that you live in 2 separate spaces. So what I mean by that is if there's going to be people who are in the office regularly, there's going to be a lot of chit chat and discussions and decision making that people who are virtual are not going to be subject to. They're not going to know what's happened. They're not going to know what those decisions are. And they're going to be left out of the loop and not asked about their opinions. They're going to be isolated if you don't actively make sure that those discussions are happening as well on your virtual collaboration platform, let's say Microsoft Teams. That's what most organizations are using. So if you're using those communication channels on Teams, make sure that it's happening in both places at the same time. We also need to make sure there's another little thing that you can do, which is to actually give people who are at a distance, your hybrid meeting attendees, give them primacy when it comes to actually speaking up. So you know that if you're in a meeting, people in the room are going to be listened to more naturally because of this bias. So what you should do is the first time that there's a question put out, go to the hybrid participants in order to make sure that you give them primacy bias when it comes to actually speaking and offering their ideas, so that they get to the table first. On that note as well, if you're having a full face-to-face team meeting and it's a working together meeting, we're doing collaborative work, do your best in order to make sure that everybody knows, the virtual attendees know in advance that it's going to be a face-to-face meeting. And the expectation is to be prepared to be on camera for that meeting so that they are there to contribute as much for that meeting. If it's just a check-in, a pulse meeting, not as essential, but if it's a working together collaboration meeting, make sure that everyone knows in advance that it's cameras on and face-to-face all together at the same time. One more thing here. So to trade off who is in person versus remote, this is one of the more powerful things to disrupt that bias. Especially if you as a leader sometimes lead remote and sometimes lead face-to-face. Sometimes you have certain people in the office, other people at home. If you're able to disrupt the fault line, if you will, then this allows people to see, well, I can lead virtually. I get listened to virtually. I can lead from in person. I get listened to there as well. So that it's not always the same people and it's not always the same setting, so that there's a trade-off and we understand that how to collaborate regardless of where we happen to be co-located at the time. So this working together, and it's working together either alone, together or apart, so you can maintain those same goals. Another point here, so the third one, realize that not everybody has the exact same needs. Right now, some people don't want to be back. Some people are thrilled. You've got the extroverts out there that are just like, woohoo, I'm going back to the office, and they're thrilled and they want to go talk to everybody. You've got the introverts that are just like, nope, I'm perfectly fine. I've had 2 years working alone. I don't really want to go back to the office. People have developed their own personal work routines of how to be effective at home. Not everybody is going to be thrilled about the hybrid environment. So do what you can to be sensitive to these differences and validate them. Meanwhile, being able to say, different organizations have taken different rules, if you will. So some of them, it's 2 days out of 5 that you have to be in. Other days, it's 3. Other organizations, it's 3 days out of 10, a 3 out of 10. Other organizations have said, just we're going to work virtually for the most part, but we'll come in kind of 2 days a month as a team meeting. There isn't a one size fits all for this because it really depends upon the nature of the work and the collaboration that you're doing. But to the extent possible, try to be sensitive to employees' needs and actually adapt to the circumstances, and accept that divergence is a key strength of your team as well. Okay, I spent a lot of time here, I think in part because this is so crucial for many of you to get that design piece right. On the communication and collaboration architectures, I'll be quick. This is basically just to say that you need to have a virtual space that mimics the face-to-face space. Now, most of you have already figured this out for the last couple of years. Essentially, it looks like Microsoft Teams or some sort of virtual collaboration where we have asynchronous work. I put ideas up there, someone's commenting on them, we have feedback, it's our file sharing, it's our ongoing team communication channel that does not mandate that we're in meetings all of the time. The decision of how to communicate, though, is also important to consider. There's this thing called media richness theory that really should drive your decisions. And what that is to say that as tasks become more complex. That is, as we need to make key decisions, we have to resolve conflicts, we have to brainstorm, we have to build ideas, we have to really use our brains and to think in depth collaboratively. That's more complex, okay? So as that happens, we need to be using richer communication media. That's either face-to-face meetings or video conference, or a combination of both of them when you have hybrid. The corollary of this, though, is that when you have low task complexity, as in you're just giving people meeting updates, it's a quick pulse, check-in, there's progress reports. Those are not complex tasks. They do not demand that you waste people's time on face-to-face meetings. Okay, so full team video conferencing, really, really good, or hybrid face-to-face equivalents of this. They're great for those complex tasks, but what we've run into is a huge Zoom fatigue. And we're going to have the same thing in the face-to-face meeting teams when we go back to hybrid. It's just a tremendous inefficiency in terms of too many meetings. And it's one of the biggest sources of burnout throughout the pandemic. People are done, and the resignation is happening, at least in part because people are exhausted from the constant meetings. So if we want people to go back to the office, we need to also be thinking, always ask yourself, do you really need another video conference meeting? Or do you really need another hybrid meeting? Do you really need another face-to-face meeting? In general, do you need another meeting? And there's better ways to get things done. I mean, if we're focusing upon complex, working together tasks, yes, good to do that. Most of the meetings aren't that. Go through your calendars. And I would highly suggest you do little things like try to, most of you could probably strip back at least 30% of the meetings on your calendar, including the meeting time on your calendar, at no loss of actual functioning. You could probably make your 60-minute meetings 50 minutes. You could make your 30-minute meetings 20 or 25-minute meetings. Make them shorter. Set your defaults in your organizations to have more time in between things so that you're in the virtual meetings, you have them shorter. There was a big trend, and I'm not against it, of having stand-up meetings. A few years back, everyone was talking about having stand-up meetings as a way of being more efficient. And stand-up meetings lead to approximately a 30% reduction in time spent in the meeting. Just actually keep people moving and keep the discussion going. All right, I've got a couple things to say on trust and positivity. Now, I've talked about this in the virtual team sessions I did a couple of years ago, so I won't go into it too much, but just basically, team trust is not just a nice to have. This is where so many teams are struggling because of the isolation. It's this idea of, well, I'm just alone. I'm not really connecting with people on a regular basis. And yet we need it. It helps people to feel psychologically safe when they feel like there's somebody else that listens to them non-judgmentally and that they feel safe to speak up and share their insights. But it's also really fragile. When we have that social distancing that happens, then it leads to trust impairments. And those trust impairments can be for social reasons, but they can also be for productivity. And if you think about it, when you no longer feel like you kind of bond with somebody, you're like, oh, well, I'll just go forward. I don't need to touch base with them. They'll just learn about it later. And so that can lead to inefficiencies because it leads to conflicts later on because you're no longer connecting. This is what we've seen with that fragmentation. So if we're not actively trying to build trust, if we're virtual or if we're hybrid, it is eroded. I will promise you that your trust is eroding if you're not trying to build it. When it erodes, people withdraw. So you hear that all the problems with cohesion and morale going on right now, a lot of that is trust, where we've just kind of withdrawn because people are just burnt out and they've had enough and there's no social connection anymore. Again, that's why we need that team design where people have the face-to-face engagements again. To do that, I would just point out, most people naturally think of kind of ability and integrity as reasons why they trust other people. They underemphasize the importance of benevolence. People are not just valuable members of your organization because they've got the knowledge and skills to do the job, or they follow through on what they say they're supposed to do. It's also because you treat them with respect, with care and compassion, and you see them as a whole person. When you're able to bring that back, people will start to actually open up again. They start to feel cared for. They start to feel there's a reason why it's actually a social community, not just a task list that they have to get done on a day-to-day basis. And that will also start to bring back positive emotions. I know it's a little crazy to think of, people feeling like they have, joy, lightheartedness, pleasure, enjoyment, excitement, these things in the workplace, but we need them. We really, really need them back. So much of the burnout that people have going on is actually because we're not paying enough attention to, how to love our teams again. So what I would encourage you to do, I would challenge you to do, is think about those different modes of working and say, okay, how do we actually build positivity and trust when we're together? We have a meal together, we chit chat about what's going on the weekend. Maybe when people are working alone apart, it's just occasionally say, hey, I'm thinking about you, let me know if you need anything. Here's a funny meme that I saw on the weekend that made me smile thinking of you. So you give people their alone time, but also still have that human connection to make it feel like you're actually bonded and that you actually have those positive moments. I would challenge all of you to go back to your team and find out how to actually build trust and positivity in each one of these modes of working. Okay, just to wrap it up on team culture, and I've said some of this on before as well in prior session, 3 foundational questions of culture: just who are we, why are we here, and how do we get it done? And what I mean by that is that we have to have every member of your team has to know the answers to these questions. And if they don't, you're fragmenting. Okay, there should be no question whatsoever that we're here because we share a certain common purpose and that we have a set of routines that help us to get it done. What I would encourage all of you to do right now, there should be celebration. I'm seeing this, every organization I talk to says we need to celebrate a little bit more. We need to work together. We need to say we've accomplished a lot and we've been through a lot in the last couple of years. Let's actually come together and find a way of recognizing people for what they've contributed, for being able to highlight what we stand for and what we're here to accomplish, to be able to bond together as a team, to rebuild those connections. That shared identity helps with everything else that we've talked about, and everything will go more smoothly if you've actually got that sense of purpose and connection back together. Your work routines have been disrupted. There is no question that everyone's opportunity to how they did the work was disrupted at the beginning of the pandemic. It's disrupted again now. Saying, oh, well, I've gotten into this comfortable routine of working at home. Why would, now I have to go back to the office and I've got to drive in and I don't know how to do these things. So, when I say good morning in the morning, it's all different now. I say hi to some people and I exclude other people. How do we get feedback during the day? How do I network? How do I get mentoring? All of these things, these work routines are completely disrupted again. So as a leader, now is the time for you to be building new work routines and to be thinking intentionally about, all right, so how do we connect? We do a 10-minute pulse meeting in the morning. All right, that's our hellos and goodbyes. How do we touch base during the day? Is it going to be virtually? Is it going to be dropping by? Do we have dedicated no email days where people are left alone every Tuesday in order to do their work? How do you share those water cooler moments? Is that face-to-face? How do you include those virtual attendees who are not there in the office? What do these work routines look like? Build them intentionally. When it comes to hybrid teams, it's all a work in progress. Like I said, we've had research on this for some number of years, but every organization is going to try things that are not going to work. The important thing is that you're open to this and that you actually have an open mind. You try it out. You pay attention to which work routines work, and then you get rid of ones that don't. You figure out which are pain points, you discuss them, you keep an open mind, listen to the employees. As employees out there, share the pain points in a way that's constructive and problem-solving focused so that you can give that upward feedback, and use the huddles because everybody's trying to figure it out in order to make this a better work environment. All right, so ultimately, I hope the recipe here will help many of you to be able to build more effective hybrid teams. And I'm hoping, Meredith, we have time for a few questions.
Hi, Jana. Yes, thank you. That was fantastic. We have lots of questions. I'm thinking we can probably go 5 minutes over if our audience can tolerate that. We've got some great stuff, and so I'm going to try to pull out some of the key themes without going into detail with all of them. We have a question here, which I think is very specific and very interesting, which a person is saying that they sit on a board and those who are physically in the room are looking at each other, and then sometimes looking at the camera, and the people who are at home watching, or the hybrid attendees, feel like they're watching a performance, like watching a meeting take place, and they don't really feel like they're part of it. And the people in the meeting don't know if they should look at each other or look to the camera. So how do you address that very fundamental issue of where to look?
No, it's interesting. So basically, in a really good hybrid design, the people are part of the audience. You think of almost like a U-shaped table, that the virtual attendees should be at the head of the table. And so their faces, their attendance should be up there as if they're just in the circle like everybody else.
Okay, so that means, so the people in the room are sort of talking to the camera. I guess this is the question, rather than only looking at the people in the room. Okay.
It should be more like a natural communication. So it depends who they're talking to. If they're speaking to somebody who's virtual, talk to the camera, because that's where they're going to be looking at them. If they're speaking to somebody who's across the table, they would not naturally look at the camera. So whatever the natural communication around a round table, that's what you should do.
Okay, so in response to this question, probably they weren't engaging with the people on Zoom enough. So probably that needs to happen.
Normal.
And I guess to speak to the point of having the people up there on the screen rather than just like a little laptop that's passed around the room.
Yeah, no, the faces really do need to be up there. And actually, even with Microsoft's new technology, they're trying to get it even more live. They're trying to have multiple different streams so that everyone is actually physically, separated on the screen up there, so you can see the virtual attendees easier.
Right. Someone has asked, you did mention the importance of people turning their cameras on. This is a huge issue for people. I mean, if you're sitting in your pajamas and it's just one of those days and you just can't be bothered and you want to be doing something else, you don't turn your camera on. How do you get people to turn their cameras on?
Yeah. This is the other thing that's really good is in the new technology, and even Outlook is saying whether or not, and even you can do it, is it a cameras on or a cameras off meeting. I think we need to be really, really clear about that. If this is a working together meeting, we're all going to get together hybrid, let's say. And so you got some people face to face and you've got some people virtually. If there's people in the room that have driven into the workplace and have gotten, their suits on or their blouses on, oh yeah, you better be on camera. Right. So if that's the nature of the meeting, and because think about it, it's like the equivalent of, I always think about I joked during the pandemic that when we come back, people are going to go get those poster boards, those, science project poster boards, and just plop them in front of them when they sit face to face.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the equivalent of what it is, right? So you can't do that, in a face-to-face setting. You shouldn't do that virtually.
But the idea of being explicit sounds good. So you're saying in the group, in the meeting invite, you're saying this is a cameras on meeting.
Yes. And that should only be the working together. If it's just progress updates, if it's, everybody's virtual and there's just one speaker, if it's a town hall, you can tell people, hey, cameras off meeting. Absolutely. Let them know.
Right. Okay. Somebody's written in to ask, do you have an advice for someone who's new to a company joining in March 2022? So after everyone had already been working remotely for a while, how do you jump into a team that's already kind of got their culture and their dynamic and their in-jokes, but everybody is sort of not quite a unit?
Yeah. Onboarding is one of the hardest things when you're fully distributed. You're going to have a hard time getting a pulse of the culture. If your leader has not specifically actually reached out to, pair you together from a mentoring or a, buddy type of a perspective, make sure that you get one of those. Find somebody, get to know someone who's really kind, and then just, ask 1,000,001 questions. Okay, so how does this work? How does this work? How does the communication work? How do we speak up? How do we, run meetings? What are the norms? The informal norms in those work routines are really the work culture. Ask tons and tons of questions, but find someone safe who can act as your cultural liaison to help answer all those questions. Good leaders, though, for all the leaders out there listening, you should be doing this. You should actually be trying to teach the organizational culture and also pairing new people up with those that are good, cultural informants, if you will.
Right. Okay, great suggestion. There are a few questions along the line of dealing with managerial or leadership teams that are being quite draconian about how it must be, or in some cases we've been told we can work on a hybrid basis, but we're told that the expectation is to be in the office 3 times a week. The rest of the team is saying, no, we only want 2 times a week. Management saying, no, it's 3 times. How do you manage those kinds of disconnects when it comes to even forming the hybrid team?
Yeah, this one's tricky because every organization, I've heard so many different mandates coming down. Some of them are just nope, you're back in the office full time. Some are 3 out of 5 or 3 out of 10. I would say to take all of these with a grain of salt. It's all just a guess. I mean, honestly, every leadership team out there is guessing as to what they think they need. And so take it with a grain of salt, as in, like, see if it works. And then, you know how I said at the end about they're all a work in progress. Have upward feedback, have the town halls, and not in a complaining kind of way, in a what I call awfulizing kind of way. We sit around and like awfulize about how horrible it is, like that's not productive. But sit back and say, okay, well, you know what we're actually finding from a team productivity perspective is that people are more productive. They're able to focus better if they're at home 3 days a week. And here's some evidence that we have in terms of, you know, how that's happened. And we've discovered that we can have all of our team meetings and the working together meetings, you know, 2 days a week. And that works really, really effectively for our team. Can we maybe have some leeway in order to, you know, adapt to our team's needs?
Right. So making more clear suggestions and not just saying, no, we want 2 days, not 3 days. Okay.
Yeah, build the case.
Here, somebody's asking if you have any suggestions for teams spanning multiple countries. This will be the true test for hybrid and not having anyone feeling left out.
Yes, that's the global virtual teams that I've been teaching on for a long time. I'd have to know more about the specifics, but yeah, we're looking at time zone differences, we're looking at cultural differences, we're looking at probably the headquarters problems. So there's often a headquarters where it's kind of dominant and people there are privileged, and then we've got people in different places that feel like they're not fully pulled into the team. If that's the case, yeah, a couple of things. Focus on asynchronous work. Make sure that virtual collaboration platform is really, really good. Meaning that if you've got 24/7 workers, then you need to make sure that when someone is done at the end of their workday, that somebody else is able to pick up on the asynchronous work and follow it for the next day, so that they're not just waiting to have face-to-face, you know, synchronous communications. So the more global you are, the more you have to focus on asynchronous work or working apart. But because of that, you have to work really, really effectively in these virtual collaboration platforms so that you can hand off. When it comes to meetings, when you actually do have synchronous meetings, figure out a time that works really, really well for most people, but don't meet too often. So you don't want to have, you know, 3 or 4 times a week, you know, kind of meetings. If you've got somebody, you know, on the call at 2 in the morning and somebody on the call at 5 in the morning, that's not going to fly, right? So find times that work really, really effectively for most of the team. And then if it's really inconvenient where somebody has to be up in the middle of the night, you can rotate that so that it's not good. It's that inconvenience everybody equally. But I think in general, and there's several other recommendations about getting together on a at least quarterly or like biannual kind of basis to kind of build some of that collaboration, because it is hard, especially when you bring in the intercultural differences, the trust even goes further away faster.
Right.
So we need to really fight that tendency in cross-cultural teams.
So you mean physically getting together?
Physically getting together, if at all possible, actually get people together. Most cross-cultural teams try to do it at least once a year, if not more.
Right. Okay, that's a great suggestion. We're really close to the end, but I've got a few people asking you for more specific recommendations on how to replace the water cooler. Virtual wine tasting, someone says, how do you, especially around onboarding, how do you get the casual in when it's a hybrid or remote situation?
Yeah, that's tricky. So if it's fully hybrid, there's different recommendations. So if you're face-to-face, that's pretty easy. We can all figure that out. One of the little things that I've learned that helps is that pre-meeting chit chat and the post-meeting chit chat, put it on Zoom. So you can actually, you know how most of the people in the office, when they're walking there, they're already catching up. They've spent the last by the time that they hit the meeting room, they've already been able to chit chat. And so the people who come in at the exact top of the hour when the meeting started have just missed out on all of that informal social networking bit. What I would encourage you to do, it's not to like kind of walk in silence to the meeting, because that's not natural human behavior either, but to just, when you get in the meeting room, open it early and actually let your meeting start 5 to 10 minutes in. So or even have the norm that everybody shows up 5 to 10 minutes before, probably better to start 5 to 10 minutes after. So that all of that informal chit chat happens with the virtual attendees part of it. Then after the meeting as well, the other thing that happens is that when the camera goes off, when the recording stops, or whenever the meeting officially ends, people keep chit-chatting face-to-face. and they make decisions. They, they have that interpersonal rapport element to it that all of the virtual attendees just missed because the camera was turned off.
Correct.
So leave it on. End your meeting 5-10 minutes early, leave it on, and let the virtual attendees actually be part of the chit chat as the meeting's wrapping up.
Is it fair as a leader to actually kind of write that in to the meeting? Like,
yeah, make it part of it.
12 o'clock, but like meet and greet or.
I'm a big fan of meetings that start 5 minutes after the hour, plus after the 5 minutes of kind of getting settled, chit chat, like, because that's part of team bonding. That's building trust.
Okay, so that's a great tip for leaders. All right, it's 2:04. I'm going to do my little plug for our some upcoming programming, which in fact, Jen, I believe you're involved in. So as we always do at the end of our webinars, we promote the programs through the Queen's Executive Education Network that we have at Smith. And so you're involved in a virtual program called Leading Hybrid Teams. Janet, are you in a position to share a couple of details about what people can expect?
Yeah, we go in more depth, way more depth about kind of some of the tips and the tools for this, and like really explore, a case in which we have that they've done this really effectively in order to kind of solve some of the specific problems that people are bringing up in the Q&A.
Okay, so there were so many more unanswered questions, and apologies to the audience that we're not getting to them. But so they can attend Leading Hybrid Teams June 20th. It's a virtual program, I believe. Yes, a 4-hour program, so not a giant commitment, but a 4-hour program. So anyone who wants information about that can visit smithqueens.com/execed and get more information. That's it for today. We will have another webinar next month. The topic for that one will be coming up shortly. You'll be seeing announcements about it in your inbox. Keep your eyes peeled there. As I said at the beginning, you'll also be getting a recording of today's presentation in your inbox. So please feel free to share that. Share it with your bosses. If you're in a hybrid team situation, get Jana's advice right into their inboxes. Jana, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. Audience, thank you so much for joining us as always, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye now.